The most popular argument for Islam today is what I call the argument from rapid growth. Islam is the world's fastest growing religion, so it must be true. But there's a variation of the argument that focuses not on Islam's growth in the world today, but on Islam's early growth. It goes like this. During the time of Muhammad and his followers, Islam spread rapidly in Arabia. It spread so rapidly that God must have been helping the Muslim community. So Islam must be the true religion. When we read the Muslim sources, we see people converting to Islam for a variety of reasons. Let's look at 4 of these reasons. So we've looked at several reasons for the rapid spread of Islam. Muhammad's ability to inspire rage and violence, Muhammad's false revelations and people's ignorance, Muhammad's promises of captives and war booty, and violent intimidation. Is there anything miraculous here? If there is, I must be missing it. Let's compare the early spread of Islam with the early spread of Christianity. The first generation of Christians went out preaching that Jesus had died on the cross and rose from the dead. Jesus' death by crucifixion was a public event. There was no disputing that. And more than 500 Christians were claiming that they had seen him alive again after his death. So they proclaimed Jesus' resurrection. There was only one problem. Many Jewish leaders, and eventually the entire Roman Empire, wanted to silence them. Think about this. In one corner, there's a small group of Christians who had no political power and wouldn't return violence for violence. They wouldn't fight. In the other corner, there's the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. What chance did the Christians have? From a worldly point of view, none. Fortunately for Christians, there are more powerful forces at work in our world than empires. In the Old Testament, God ordained some important festivals for the Jews. 2 of the most important festivals were the Passover festival and the Festival of Weeks, or Pentecost. Jews would travel to Jerusalem for their major festivals. As time went on, many nations conquered the Jews. Some of these nations would take Jews to different parts of their empire. But because of the Jewish laws, Jews generally wouldn't intermingle with people from other nations, so they were able to retain their identity as Jews. Eventually, there were groups of Jews around the Middle East, across northern Africa, and in Europe. Many of these Jews would return to Jerusalem for the major feasts, if they were able. Jesus was crucified when the Jews had gathered in Jerusalem for the Passover festival. 2 to 3 million Jews would have been in Jerusalem at the time, and many of them would have heard about Jesus being crucified since he had caused quite a stir. A few days later, some of these Jews would have even heard rumors that Jesus had risen from the dead. Then they would have gone back to their homes in Arabia, Egypt, Rome, and all sorts of other places. 7 weeks after Jesus' death by crucifixion, there was the Festival of Weeks, Pentecost. Jerusalem would have again been filled with Jews traveling to be with their brothers and sisters. That's when the Holy Spirit fell on more than 100 of the original Christians. Suddenly, they were able to speak in the languages of Jews from 3 different continents. As we read in the opening verses of Acts chapter 2, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said, "They have had too much wine." The Apostle Peter preached a sermon, and around 3,000 Jews became Christians. But this time, when the feast was over, these Jewish believers didn't go home. They stayed with the apostles to learn about Jesus Christ from his disciples. This is one of the main reasons we read about Christians selling their property to fund the early church. There were people who had come from other countries to celebrate a festival, but they ended up staying with the disciples. So Christians who had property would sell it to support this international Christian community living in Jerusalem. Eventually, after the stoning of a Christian named Stephen, a massive persecution broke out against the Christians living in Jerusalem, which included Christians from 3 different continents. It was then that these people who had come from all over the Roman Empire and from other places left Jerusalem and went back to their homes, fully equipped to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. By that time, it was too late for the Romans or anyone else to stop Christianity. There were already thousands of Christians spread across 3 continents, preaching the gospel in their native language, and many of these Christians had learned about Jesus from his original followers. So why did Christianity expand so rapidly? Christianity spread because it was grounded in a miracle that people could examine and verify, and that instantly set it apart from other religions. But this is only part of the story, because the expansion was hastened due to an amazing series of events. Jewish festivals, the victories of various nations over the Jews, Old Testament laws that kept the Jews from intermingling with other groups, Jesus' death and resurrection when Jews were gathered for Passover, the outpouring of God's Holy Spirit when Jews were gathered for Pentecost, and the persecution of Christians, sending them back to their own countries, all worked together for the spread of the gospel. So Christianity spread because of miracles amplified by a miraculous series of events. It spread so far, so fast, that it conquered the most powerful empire the world had ever seen without killing anyone. Islam, by contrast, spread because of lust, greed, fear, violence, and ignorance. You tell me which one came from God.